What happens when the very people meant to protect a child become their worst nightmare? In a quiet town, a horrifying secret lurked behind closed doors for over a decade. But how did a case like this stay hidden for so long? And what happens when it finally comes to light? Tonight, we uncover the chilling tale of a young survivor whose courage would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. But there's more to this case than meets the eye. One predator is behind bars, but the other, still on the run, could be hiding in plain sight. The search is on, but will justice be served in time? This is the case of John D. Hart and Sarah Miller. Stay with us as we reveal the twists and turns that made this one of the most chilling cases to unfold in recent memory. It was December 2023 when everything changed. A small, seemingly insignificant tip slipped into the hands of a detective who had no idea how much it would unravel. The investigation had begun as a routine case, nothing more than a dull inquiry into an unrelated matter. But as the witness spoke, the words they dropped hit like a stone, sinking deep in the calm waters of a quiet office. John DeHart, the witness said, voice trembling. It was a name that hadn't been uttered in years. A name that would pull the detective into a web of horror, stretching back over a decade. The witness seemed unaware of the gravity of what they had just revealed. The detective, however, froze, the pen in his hand hovering above the case notes. There it was, the name he never expected to hear. DeHart was tied to something far more sinister than the case they were originally working on. The witness had no way of knowing it, but their casual remark would be the first domino in a series of events that would finally expose a crime buried under years of silence. It was a lead so cold, yet somehow it felt hotter than the summer sun, brimming with hidden truths. The detective leaned forward, his voice steady but urgent. What do you know about him? The witness shifted uneasily, their gaze darting around the room. It was a long time ago, but there was a child. Something terrible happened, worse than anything you can imagine. The words lingered in the air, suffocating the room with an unbearable weight. The detective, now fully alert, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. This wasn't just another case, it was a path to something far darker. The detective scribbled down the name, his heart pounding with sudden, sharp urgency. What could be worse than anything he could imagine? The witness, eyes wide with fear, continued, but the words were starting to blur together as the detective's mind raced. This wasn't just a forgotten memory. It was a cry for help, a whisper from the past, finally finding its way into the light. In that instant, the investigation wasn't just about following leads. It was about uncovering the truth. The truth of what had happened all those years ago. As the witness's words faded into the background, the detective's thoughts turned to one question. How many others had suffered because no one had spoken up? Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a picturesque town where the sound of children's laughter echoed through the streets, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings. At first glance, it appeared to be a place untouched by tragedy, an idyllic haven of suburban tranquility. A place where secrets seemed impossible to hide. But behind the soft glow of streetlights and the quiet hum of life, there was a darkness creeping beneath the surface, hidden from the eyes of unsuspecting onlookers. One unassuming house on Sates Drive became the center of that darkness. To the outside world, it was just another, modest, neatly kept home. But the sinister truth within its walls was waiting, quietly, patiently, for the right moment to come to light. Between 2011 and 2013, a child no older than 4 years old was trapped in the nightmare that unfolded behind those closed doors. Two adults, entrusted with the care of this innocent soul, would betray that trust in the most monstrous way imaginable. John DeHart and Sarah Miller, the very people who should have been protecting this child, became their tormentors. The house itself was unremarkable. A typical suburban home with a small lawn and a white picket fence, its appearance as ordinary as any other. But for the child who lived there, it was a prison, a place where fear, manipulation, and suffering were woven into the fabric of everyday life. The living room, the kitchen, even the bedroom, each room bore the echoes of terror, of moments too awful to even speak of. It wasn't just the violence that made this story so insidious. It was the subtlety with which it took root. The way the child learned, piece by piece, that escape wasn't possible. At first, they were too young to understand. Every child's nightmare seemed to be a distant thing, the stuff of horror stories. But soon, their own reality would become a nightmare far worse than anything imagined. The night would begin like any other. The dim light of the hallway, the soft shuffle of feet, the creak of the stairs as the child made their way into the hallway. There was no reason to suspect anything was amiss. But when they entered that bedroom, everything would change. The room was no longer a place of safety. It had become a cage. What happened next would set the stage for years of suffering. The child, small and confused, walked into the room unaware of the horrors that awaited. John DeHart and Sarah Miller knew exactly what they were doing. A simple smile, a false sense of security. It was all part of the act, an act that would strip the child of their innocence in ways too vile to describe. The first moments were a blur of confusion. Fear crept in as the child struggled to understand the violation. Was this a dream? Was this what it was like to grow up? But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the child would learn quickly that there was no escape. If they resisted, there was punishment. If they fought back, there was pain. The basement was where it happened, the dark, cold, suffocating place where the worst of the abuse occurred. It was more than a room. It was a symbol of total domination, a space that consumed the victim's sense of self, reducing them to nothing more than a silent object in the eyes of their captors. Every time the door to the basement slammed shut, the child's heart would race. The air would grow heavy, thick with dread. How long would they be left in the dark this time? The cold floor would bite at their skin, the darkness so complete they couldn't tell if their eyes were open or shut. No sound, except the constant ticking of the clock, a reminder that time in this place seemed endless. But the real horror was in the silence. It was in the powerlessness that crept into every waking moment. The child's cries were swallowed by the dark, their pleas unheard by anyone who could help. And yet, even in the darkest moments, the child wasn't alone. Two others lived in that house, other victims of DeHart and Miller's cruelty. Each had their own terrifying stories. Each knew that the horror was inevitable. When one of them was taken away, they would return broken. But who would speak? Who could? In the seemingly quiet streets of Lancaster County, a brutal reality was unfolding, and no one knew. How long could the truth remain hidden? The whispers of the past began to echo, growing louder with each passing day. The walls of that house knew everything. And soon, so would the world. The detective sat across from the victim, a person now grown, but whose eyes still carried the weight of years of silence. The room felt thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken words. The victim trembled, not from fear of the detective, but from the fear of the past, a past they had buried so deep, they were unsure they could ever unearth it without being consumed. For over a decade, they had carried this burden alone. The memories, raw and unrelenting, clawed at the edges of their mind, but for years, the victim had been unable to speak. Until now. "I never told anyone," the victim whispered, their voice barely audible. Not a single soul. Their eyes flickered, searching the detective's face as though looking for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or a sign that they weren't about to fall back into the black hole of terror they had spent so many years avoiding. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of a clock on the wall. The detective leaned forward, listening closely, knowing this was no ordinary interview. This wasn't just a confession. This was a fracture in time, an eruption of something long buried, and it would change everything. The victim closed their eyes for a moment, as though summoning the courage to continue. The first night, they began, voice shaking. It had been like any other. But the words they spoke next were far from ordinary. The victim described walking into the bedroom of John DeHart and Sarah Miller, unaware that this innocent moment would fracture their childhood forever. "I thought it was just another night. I didn't know what was coming." A chill ran down the detective's spine. The victim's voice trembled, but grew more resolute with each word. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as they continued, the horror of the memories becoming real once again. The scene that unfolded in their recollection was too grotesque, too incomprehensible. The touch that should have been tender was anything but. The victim had tried to pull away, but DeHart's grip was unyielding, his voice like ice. "Don't be a bad kid," he had threatened. "If you don't obey, you'll end up in the basement." The basement. The words echoed in the victim's mind, and their body went rigid as they relived it. They could feel the darkness again, the oppressive weight of the cold, the suffocating silence that was the true horror. The basement, the one place the victim dreaded more than anything, became their prison. When the door shut behind them, the world went black. No light, no sound, just the cold and the waiting. For hours, the victim sat in that freezing darkness, naked, unsure of when, or if, they would ever be allowed back upstairs. Every second felt like an eternity as their body trembled from the chill, their thoughts racing in circles. They tried to scream, but their cries were swallowed whole, muffled by the thick walls that imprisoned them in more ways than one. But it wasn't just the darkness that haunted them. It was the fear that their words, if they ever spoke out, would be their undoing. The threats were not empty, they were real. The small gun DeHart had pointed at them, the cold warning in his voice. "This is a warning," he had said. The victim's breath caught at the memory. But they pressed on. They needed to say it. They had to speak the truth now, finally. The basement wasn't just a place of punishment. It was where the silence festered, where they were conditioned to believe that speaking out meant worse pain, worse punishment. For years, the child had sat in that darkness, not knowing whether they would ever see light again, not knowing whether anyone would believe them if they did speak. The victim wiped away a tear, but it wasn't just the pain of recalling those years that made them falter. It was the shame, the suffocating weight of it, that they had carried alone. It had taken them this long to understand that the silence wasn't their fault. They hadn't been the bad kid. They hadn't deserved any of it. "Why didn't you speak sooner?" The detective's voice was gentle, yet insistent. There was no judgment in his tone, just curiosity. But the question hung in the air, a cruel reminder that silence had lasted for so long. The victim shifted, their gaze dropping to the floor. "I was too scared to believe anyone would listen. I thought I was the only one." But they weren't the only one. And they wouldn't be the last to speak. Slowly, the detective felt the heavy weight of the room lift, knowing that the truth, no matter how dark, was finally surfacing. The victim's bravery would send ripples through the investigation. Ripples that would lead them to uncover more than they could have ever imagined. But the question still loomed: what had kept them silent for so long? And as the detective looked into the victim's eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth was breaking free, and once it was out, there would be no going back. The basement was not just a room, it was a prison, a place where the laws of time and comfort no longer applied. For the child, it was the one place where the darkness swallowed them whole, both physically and emotionally. It was cold, bitterly cold. The kind of cold that settled deep in your bones, making you feel like the chill would never leave. The victim's skin, bare against the unforgiving air, would tremble in the pitch black, no light to offer even the faintest hope of escape. The walls, once a neutral shade, now seemed to pulse with the weight of the unspeakable things that had happened here. The silence was suffocating, unnatural. Time blurred. Hours felt like days, days like years. DeHart had a way of making the basement feel alive, alive with dread. The sound of his boots on the stairs, the creak of the door as it slammed shut, was enough to send the child's heart into a frenzy. The cold, the isolation, the uncertainty. Each moment in the basement felt like an eternity. And then, there were the threats. "Don't speak," he'd whisper before the door closed, his words a promise more than a warning. Each time, the child's chest would tighten with fear, knowing that silence was their only option. If they made a sound, they would be punished. And the punishments were always worse than the silence itself. On the worst nights, DeHart would return with a flashlight, its beams slicing through the dark, illuminating only the corners of the room. But it wasn't just the flashlight that struck fear into the victim's heart. It was the gleam in DeHart's eyes, something cold, calculating. His voice would come then, as if savoring the terror he knew his presence caused. "Sit still, don't move, don't make a sound," he'd command. The victim would obey, trembling, wondering if this night might be the one where they never saw daylight again. Then came the gun. That small, black object that seemed so much larger when it was pointed at them. "This is a warning," Dehart had said, his voice as cold as the air around them. The threat hung in the air, palpable. The victim's mind raced, every sense heightened, waiting for the inevitable. What would come next? The cold darkness of the basement felt like a tomb. The walls pressed in, stifling the victim's breath. Alone, terrified, the child began to question time itself. How long had they been down there? Was it an hour? A day? The silence had a weight of its own, so thick, so suffocating, it seemed to fill every crevice, every corner. The victim wasn't alone, but they felt like they were. Other children were there too, but their suffering was just as silent. None of them dared speak of what they had endured, for fear of the consequences. They knew better than to challenge Dehart's rules. No one had to ask what had happened to the others. Their tear-streaked faces spoke volumes. Each night, the victim endured the same cycle. The basement, the silence, the waiting. And every time they thought they might break free, Dehart's voice would return. "If you're not a good kid, you'll stay here forever." The victim had no choice but to comply. Survival wasn't about fighting, it was about hiding. Hiding in plain sight, hiding their emotions, their pain. In the darkness, there was no room for anything but fear. The air inside the interrogation room was thick with unspoken truths. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, their hum a distant static against the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Time stretched unbearably. The witness sat hunched over, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table's cold surface, their breath uneven. Detective Monroe had conducted hundreds of interviews, seen hardened criminals lie straight-faced, seen broken souls spill their darkest secrets. But something about this one was different. The tension was suffocating, as if the very walls were bracing for what was about to be said. Then came the name, John Dehart. The detective's pen, poised mid-sentence, froze. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. It was a name she hadn't heard in over a decade, a name buried in forgotten records. She looked up, locking eyes with the witness. "What do you know about him?" Her voice was steady, but inside her pulse was thrumming like a warning drum. The witness hesitated. They weren't supposed to say this, but the words clawed their way out anyway. It was a long time ago, but there was a child, and what happened to them, it was worse than anything you can imagine. Monroe leaned forward, her knuckles tightening around the pen. A child. The weight of those two words pressed down on her chest. Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that suffocates. The kind that means something monstrous is lurking just beneath the surface. And then, in a trembling voice, the witness began to speak, and the nightmare began to unfold. The search for Sarah Miller had begun. She had vanished like smoke, slipping through the cracks of the world she once controlled. The day John Dehart was taken into custody, investigators thought it would only be a matter of time before they found her. But days turned into weeks, and Miller remained a ghost. No digital footprints, no credit card transactions, no known associates willing to talk. It was as if she had never existed. Detectives knew this wasn't a simple disappearance. It was a calculated escape. Miller wasn't running in panic. She was hiding with purpose. Every lead brought them to a dead end. Her last known address in Nanticoke, Luzerne County, had long since been abandoned. Surveillance cameras near her old haunts caught nothing, but they weren't about to let her slip away. Law enforcement escalated their efforts. The FBI joined the hunt, issuing a nationwide alert. Miller's face was plastered across news broadcasts, her alias, Sarah Suter, circulating through every database. Tip lines flooded with possible sightings. Some real, most false. But one stood out. A gas station attendant in Charleston, West Virginia reported something odd. A woman who matched Miller's description had paid in cash. No ID, no unnecessary conversation, just gas and a pack of cigarettes. The station's cameras were conveniently angled away from her face, but the timing was right. The scent of her trail was faint, but it was there. Detectives moved swiftly. Undercover officers set up in the area. They didn't know when she'd return, but Miller had made a mistake. She was still in motion. She was still out there. And now, they were closing in. The question wasn't if they'd find her. It was when. It was just after 5 p.m. when the call came in. A woman matching Sarah Miller's description had been spotted near a rundown motel just outside Charleston, West Virginia. She had been seen earlier at a gas station, paying in cash, avoiding security cameras, her hood pulled up as if shielding herself from more than just the cold. But someone had recognized her. Someone who had been watching the news. The FBI wasn't taking any chances. Unmarked vehicles moved into position, their tinted windows concealing the agents inside. A team of undercover officers had already secured a vantage point, watching the motel's room 107, the one Miller had checked into under a fake name just hours before. Inside one of the surveillance vans, Agent Lawson studied the grainy live feed from a street camera. The motel's neon vacancy sign flickered in the dimming daylight, casting eerie red light across the parking lot. Then, movement. A dark-colored sedan pulled in slowly, its headlights sweeping across the cracked pavement. The driver, a woman, alone. Her hands gripped the wheel tight, her knuckles white. Miller. "She's here," Lawson murmured into his radio. Outside, officers tensed, hands hovering near their holsters. They had rehearsed this scenario. Miller could be armed, she could run, or she could fight. The sedan rolled to a stop. For a moment, she just sat there, unmoving, staring ahead as if she knew this was the end. Then, she reached for the door. "Move, now." Within seconds, agents surged forward. The air exploded with the sound of boots pounding pavement, radios crackling, commands being shouted. "Sarah Miller, step out of the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." For a split second she didn't move. Her fingers clutched the steering wheel, her breath ragged. She had been running for months. This was the moment it all came crashing down. Then, slowly, she lifted both hands. As the door swung open, officers rushed forward, weapons drawn. "On the ground, now!" She didn't fight. She didn't speak. She simply sank to her knees, her expression eerily vacant, as if she had known all along that this day would come. The cuffs clicked around her wrists. Sarah Miller was in custody. The hunt was over. But justice was only beginning. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that suffocated. The kind that settled heavy in the chest, pressing down with the weight of what was about to unfold. Sarah Miller and John DeHart sat at the defense table, their expressions unreadable. The fluorescent lights cast shadows on their faces, but no amount of dim lighting could conceal the truth. They had nowhere left to hide. The survivors sat just feet away, older now, stronger. But as the bailiff called for order, the memories of what had been done to them loomed large. This was their moment, their chance to finally be heard. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the evidence piece by piece, brick by brick, reconstructing the horrors that had once been locked behind the doors of that house on Sites Drive. Photos of the crime scene, testimonies from forensic experts, the voices of 3 broken childhoods, now adults, stepping forward to shatter the silence. Then, the first victim took the stand. They were no longer a helpless child, no longer afraid of the dark basement or the whispers of punishment. But the scars remained. The prosecutor's voice was gentle but firm. "Tell us what happened." A breath, a long pause. Then the truth spilled out. The nights of terror, the suffocating fear, the threats. Their voice wavered but did not break. They had spent years believing no one would believe them. But now, in front of the world, their words were undeniable. A second survivor followed. Then a third. Each testimony sent waves of horror through the courtroom. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reporters scribbled furiously into their notepads. Even the judge's face, hardened by years of presiding over grim cases, remained unreadable but heavy with the gravity of it all. Then came the defense's turn. DeHart's attorney tried to sow doubt, poking holes, questioning memories blurred by childhood trauma. But it was useless. The truth was too strong. And then there was Miller. She never looked up, never met the eyes of the victims. Not once. The final witness, a survivor now in their 20s, turned toward her, their voice steady. "I spent years thinking I was worthless, thinking no one would believe me. But today, I take back my voice." The words cut through the air like a knife. The jury was sent to deliberate. 30 minutes passed, then an hour, then 2, then a verdict. The tension coiled in the room like a wire pulled too tight. The judge returned. The courtroom stood still. The foreman's voice rang clear. John DeHart, guilty. Sarah Miller, guilty. A collective exhale. A flood of emotions. A justice that had been too long in the making. The judge's gavel struck. Life without parole. The survivors did not cheer. This wasn't a victory, it was survival. As DeHart was led away, his eyes remained cold, his face betraying nothing. Miller, for the first time, looked up. But there was no redemption in her gaze, only the weight of a life spent running. And the final realization, there was no escape left. The courtroom was empty now. The voices that once echoed within its walls had faded, replaced by a silence so profound it felt almost hollow. Justice had been served. But what came after a verdict? What happened when the gavel fell and the world moved on? For the survivors, the battle was far from over. Their lives had been defined by the horrors of Sate's drive. Now, for the first time, they faced an uncertain future. A future without their captors, but not without their ghosts. One survivor, now in their 20s, sat in the quiet of a therapy room days after the sentencing. The scars weren't visible, but they were there. A therapist's voice cut through the stillness. "How do you feel now that it's over?" A long pause. "It's not over." Because the past doesn't simply fade with a guilty verdict. Memories don't vanish overnight. The nightmare still came, unbidden. The weight of years spent in silence didn't lift so easily. Across town, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. The house on Sites Drive still stood, untouched. An empty shell where horrors had unfolded, now just another structure in a quiet neighborhood. Some wanted it demolished, erased from existence, like the people who once ruled within it. Others believed it should remain, a warning of the evil that can lurk behind closed doors. Reporters flocked to the abandoned property, cameras flashing, their voices filled with speculation. What happens to a place that held so much darkness? In the weeks that followed, advocacy groups amplified their voices. The case had exposed more than just two criminals. It had shone a light on a system that too often failed to protect the most vulnerable. New laws were proposed. Conversations about childhood abuse grew louder. More survivors of similar horrors began to step forward, finding the courage to tell their own stories. But for the survivors of this case, the most important battle lay ahead, learning to live. One of them stood before a mirror, staring at their reflection, at the person who had once been powerless, but was still here. They had spoken. They had been heard. And now, for the first time, they could begin again. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it lives next door. It waves to us. It shops at grocery stores. It tucks children into bed. And sometimes it goes unseen for years. The case of John DeHart and Sarah Miller was more than just a crime. It was a revelation, a wake-up call, a reminder of how darkness can exist in plain sight. For over a decade, a house on Sites Drive concealed horrors beyond imagination. 3 children suffered in silence. The walls of that house held their cries, muffled their pain, swallowed their pleas for help. But how? How did it go unnoticed for so long? The truth is, monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like ordinary people. They manipulate, they deceive, and they rely on silence to protect them. That is the lesson. Silence allows evil to thrive. And in cases like this, silence is often born from fear. Fear of not being believed, fear of retaliation, fear of facing the past. The survivors of this case had spent years locked in that fear, convinced that no one would listen, until one voice changed everything. A single witness in an unrelated case mentioned a name, and the walls of secrecy began to crumble. The truth clawed its way to the surface. A past that had been buried forced its way into the light, and that's why speaking up matters. For every case like this that is uncovered, how many others remain in the dark? How many victims still suffer, convinced that no one will believe them? The case of John DeHart and Sarah Miller serves as proof that monsters can be unmasked. But only if we listen, only if we pay attention to the signs, and most importantly, only if we refuse to stay silent. If you see something, say something. You could save a life. As we conclude today's journey into the depths of this chilling crime, we're reminded of the many layers that hide behind each story. The truths we uncover, the mysteries that remain, and the questions that linger long after the investigation is over. These are the things that echo through our minds, keeping us searching for answers. But remember, the story doesn't end here. If this story has left you with more questions than answers, you're not alone. Every crime carries its own dark echo, an unresolved whisper that keeps us on the edge of our seats. So, if you're ready to dive deeper into the mysteries, uncover more shocking cases, and explore the stories that will haunt your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Criminals Echoes. Join our community of true crime enthusiasts and be the first to uncover the truth in every twist and turn. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and follow us as we continue to shed light on the darkest corners of criminal history. Have your theories, thoughts, or insights on today's case? Drop them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and remember, every crime has its echo.